in a 4-part webinar series where we are looking at the issues of equity in early childhood education. My name is Linda Smith, for those of you who don't know me, and I am the director of the Early Childhood Initiative at the Bipartisan Policy Center here in Washington, D.C. And if you don't know the BPC, we are a Washington-based think tank that tries to look at the best ideas from both sides of the aisle to promote the best policies that we can here in Congress and in legislation. So before we get started, actually, and I introduce my colleague, I want to take care of a few housekeeping details. We always get the question, are the slides going to be available? Yes, they will. They'll be posted along with Q&As. If we can't take all the questions at the end of this, we will be posting the answers to your questions. So feel free to include your questions in even if we don't, if we don't get to them, feel free to keep putting them in there. Finally, just a note that the report is that we're going to be talking about today is posted on both the BPC website as well as the Children's Equity Project, and that gives me time to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Chantel Meek, who is the founding director of the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University. And over the last year or so, the two of us have been sponsoring a series of roundtables and discussions to examine the issue of equity in the early years. So before we get into the details of this particular one, I want to thank Barbara Chow and the Heising Simon Foundation for the funding of this project. It was very important work. At the time, we had no idea that what was to come when we started the work, but I think we have some very important policy recommendations to make that might help inform things as we move forward in this country around this issue. So today's topic, and I'll be short, is going to talk about the issues of harsh discipline in early childhood programs and what that sets in motion for children's lives. And so I think most people who hear us talk about this find it is appalling to find that children are expelled from early childhood programs at 2, 3, and 4 years of age. It's just incomprehensible. Some of this has to do with for most of it has to do with behavior that is absolutely developmentally appropriate. But we have to deal with some of the issues around the workforce and their training on this, as well as understanding what discipline works and what doesn't. And I think this particular webinar will try to examine these issues around harsh discipline and how we as a nation need to move forward to rethink some of this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chantel Meek, who is going to guide the conversation. She will introduce the topic with a series of slides and then a panel that will follow that will be discussing this issue in depth, and a panel of various distinguished experts in this field. So Chantel, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Linda. We at the Children's Equity Project are thrilled to have you and the Bipartisan Policy Center as partners in this important work around systemic racism and equity for our youngest learners. We also want to thank the Heising Simons Foundation for generous funding for this work. And I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. As many of you know, the Children's Equity Project and Bipartisan Policy Center released a new report, Start with Equity from the Early Years to the Early Grades, last week. The full report covers 3 key inequities in our learning system that we know are having a disproportionate impact on our youngest learners, especially those from historically marginalized communities, our Black children, our brown children, our Native American children, and our children with disabilities. If we could get the first slide, that'd be great. Perfect. The full report covers 3 key issue areas. So these are the 3 issue areas that are covered in the report. Harsh discipline and its disproportionate application in learning settings, which is going to be the focus of today's webinar. We also look at the lack of inclusion or segregated learning for young children with disabilities and inequities that exist within that. And we then look at inequitable access to high quality learning opportunities for our dual these 3 issue areas and eliminating racial disparities within them. By doing this, we can begin to transform children's learning experiences and close opportunity gaps. Of course, these three issue areas do not encompass all of the inequities our children face across multiple different systems and even within our own systems. But we have to meaningfully address economic justice, fair and affordable housing, wealth gap, segregation, and equitable funding, and many other issue areas to get there. But we believe that there are significant contributors to the unequal state of our systems today. For each of these issue areas, we deeply reviewed the research and the data landscape, and informed by that, we provide an actionable and concrete policy agenda. Next slide, please. So today we're going to take a deep dive into harsh discipline and its disproportionate application. Harsh discipline, and especially exclusionary discipline, is one of the most concrete manifestations of the preschool to prison pipeline in education policy today. Kids can't learn if they're literally pushed out of school. It's also harder to learn when you're being subject to other abuses like physical abuse via corporal punishment and solitary confinement like conditions via seclusion. So as our country continues having a dialogue on race and systemic racism in America, we must ensure that school pushout and harsh discipline more broadly is part of our reform agenda. Together with BPC, we developed a public policy roadmap in this space that can help us address harsh discipline and close gaps. So these, on the right side of the slide, you'll see this is how we define harsh discipline more broadly. It includes corporal punishment, it includes suspension and expulsion, and it includes seclusion and restraint used inappropriately. I should note that seclusion and restraint were never intended to be used as discipline measures. They're supposed to be used as emergency behavior management measures that are used very rarely and not at all implemented as punishment. But unfortunately, we found in several reports, and most recently an investigative report, that it is abused and that it is used for punishment in ways that it was never intended. Next slide, please. So here's a summary of what we know. We're going to dig into what we found in our review of the data and of the research. We know that harsh discipline starts early. We know that it happens often, and we know that it's disproportionately applied. We know that we have preliminary evidence that it occurs even in infant toddler childcare programs. So we said preschool to prison pipeline earlier. There is some evidence, emerging evidence, that it starts even sooner than that. One of the most important things we found, and others who study this will not be surprised, but there is absolutely no evidence that shows that any of these forms of harsh discipline work. They don't work to improve child behavior in the short term or long term. They don't work in any sense of the word. They are not an effective intervention, and they're not an intervention at all. However, there is an abundant amount of evidence that shows that these harsh forms of discipline have negative effects on young children. We know that early suspension expulsion predicts later suspension and expulsion, so it kicks off kind of a trajectory and a cycle. We know that it's associated with decreased engagement in learning. We know that it's associated with grade retention and lower levels of high school graduation, and even interaction with the criminal justice system much later in life when kids grow up to be adults. We know that rates and disparities in the rates vary between and within state lines. We know that the disparities and the rates are really driven by a complex set of factors that include bias, that include inadequate training of teachers and principals and others who are kind of having direct interaction with children and making these decisions. We know that it is influenced by misguided policies like the zero tolerance policy wave that we saw take hold the last several years ago. We know that poor working conditions also contribute to exclusionary discipline in particular. So when teachers have really long hours, when they don't have an adequate number or appropriate number of breaks, we know that that's associated with increased rates of discipline, harsh discipline. We know that when teachers don't have supports like mental health coaches or other types of training and support to address children's social emotional development, they are more likely to rely on this type of harsh and exclusionary discipline. We know that there are a handful of interventions that are out in the field right now. Some of them are very widely scaled that work to decrease exclusionary discipline. We know that very few, however, have been shown to reduce disparities within exclusionary discipline. Some of those that are having are beginning to provide some emerging evidence, positive behavior intervention support, which you'll hear about a little bit more in the panel, is doing some investigating on reducing that disparity. And there are other models as well, but very, very few. We know that harsh discipline is largely unregulated at the federal level, with the exception of some data collection requirements, data reporting requirements. We know that there was a large influx of state and local community level policy that has developed and cropped up, especially in exclusionary discipline, so suspension and expulsion, since 2014, when the first round of preschool suspension expulsion federal data were released. And we, at the federal level, engaged in a lot of work and policy around trying to decrease the use of exclusionary discipline in early childhood settings and through the K-12 continuum. We also know, however, that although there has been a lot of state and local policy on this issue over the last several years, that the quality of the policies greatly vary. The extent of the coverage, so who gets protections and who doesn't, varies greatly. The supports that have been paired with those policies and the funding for those supports varies greatly. And there's a whole number of other quality indicators with respect to policy that we go over in the full report. Next slide, please. So we're going to start first with exclusionary discipline, which we count as suspension and expulsion. Suspension being temporary removal from school or childcare program or early childhood program, childcare program, and expulsion being the permanent termination of a child's participation in the school or in the childcare program or in their preschool program more broadly. Next slide, please. So here's what we know. We know that federal data find that 5,000 children in public pre-K were suspended in 1 year alone. We know that young children, that's children in preschool, are about 3 times more likely to be expelled from their public pre-K than children in K-12 settings. We also know that there are some small studies, state-specific studies that have kind of looked at this rate in childcare settings, and we know that it might be much higher than that number, even in childcare settings. We also know that in 2016, the Department of Health and Human Services included a question on suspensions and expulsions in a national parent survey. So this was the very first time that we asked parents on a national scale if their child had been suspended, if their young child had been suspended. And that's really significant because the federal data we had before and that we still have as part of the civil rights data collection at the Department of Education relies kind of on education administrators to report that information as opposed to parents. And what they found in the data, what the data revealed, were that the numbers were much, much higher when you ask parents, and that, of course, also included parents of children who are not just in public pre-K, but in childcare and in other types of preschool systems and settings. Next slide, please. So if we get back to that slide, that's okay. We couple more. There we go. So I mentioned a little bit earlier the infants and toddlers. There's emerging evidence that even in our youngest learners, infants and toddlers and babies, are also excluded at really high rates. There were a couple studies that have been conducted recently that one of them, they're both state-specific studies, 42% of infant toddler childcare programs reported expelling a child in the past year. In another study, 26% of programs have reported expelling a child in the last year. And by comparison, Dr. Walter Gilliam, who is on our panel today, we're excited to have, his 2005 study that looked at expulsion and suspension in public pre-K settings found that just over 10% of those teachers had reported expelling a child, which is already a much higher rate than what you find in K-12. Next slide, please. So we know that the rates are high, that we see disparities across ages and systems. We also know reliably that there are racial disparities in suspension and expulsion. There has been this pattern of Black children in particular being overrepresented in suspension and expulsion has been consistent in every study and in every way that we look at it since we started really recording this data. That has never changed. So today, what we find, these are your preschool numbers. For Black boys, they make up about 19% of preschool enrollment, but 45%, nearly half, of male preschool suspension. And for girls, the disparity looks even higher, although the numbers are less. They make up 20% of female enrollment, but over half of all female suspensions. Next slide, please. We also know that there are, when we look at, that there are some disparities when we look at American Indian, Alaska Native population, and also Latino children. Although the disproportionality varies, and it's not consistent study by study or state by state. We do know in general that these kids are generally excluded at higher rates in the later grades. But again, like I said, that data and research is unreliable, and the I guess gravity of the disparity and the severity of the disparity really varies across studies and data sets and states. We know that children within the AAPI group have significantly different rates within that group. So it's really important to look at them, kind of parse out children in that group. We know that Pacific Islander children had a risk ratio that was 4 times greater than Asian American children, yet they're usually kind of lumped into one category when we look at this issue. If we turn to look at kids with disabilities, we know that children, school-age children with disabilities are at least twice as likely to be excluded. And we don't, at least the civil rights data collection data show that there isn't disproportionality noted in younger children with disabilities, so children in preschool. It is important to note, though, a few caveats, and you'll see some asterisks there for that reason. Children with disabilities may be identified after preschool, so once they enter kind of formal education. And so it's really difficult to know if the children who were eventually identified were kind of the same children that were, potentially kicked out of preschool or early childhood programs before they had that disability diagnosis. So it's difficult to tell what that looks like in the early years. Next slide, please. So this is really hard to see. I apologize about that, but the slides will be online. But really what we're trying to show here, we did an analysis looking at the early years and the early grades, public pre-K through kind of 5th grade, the elementary school zone. And we looked at exclusionary discipline by state across the country. And we looked at rates per 1,000 children to control for population. And these are the rates kind of across the country. We know that Mississippi and South Carolina, I believe that's Alabama, up there kind of make up the top 3. And down at the bottom are Utah, I think Massachusetts, Maryland, and some others with the lowest rates of suspending and expelling young children. Next slide, please. We also know, we looked at racial disparities and the rate difference between children in exclusionary discipline and suspension in particular. And what we did here was we took the rate for all children, and then we looked at the rate for Black children, since Black children are really the ones that are most reliably overrepresented in the school push-out numbers. And then we calculated a difference score between those two numbers to identify, what the disparities look like and those differences look like across the country. And as you'll see here, the states with the maroon had the highest difference rate between Black children and their peers. Then the kind of the dark orange from there on, and then with the yellow states having the lowest amount of difference. The state with the highest number of difference, or the highest disparity between Black children and their peers, was Ohio, and the state with the lowest was Hawaii. Next slide, please. So what does policy look like then? We examined the policy landscape across discipline. And as I mentioned earlier, there's been a wave of new policy moves across the last 7-8 years across childcare, Head Start, and public pre-K. So we'll break those down really briefly, starting with childcare. So in 2014, the Child Care and Development Block Grant was reauthorized. And for the first time ever, it included some language on suspensions and expulsions. And in particular, it required states to report what their policies were in this issue area. And that's really significant because most, if not all states, did not have a policy at all on this issue. And what we'd often see was that local programs would kind of manage this on an ad hoc, case-by-case basis. There were also many actual early childhood programs that didn't have a policy or written policy on this either, and kind of managed it case-by-case. So since then, since that requirement was kicked into that law, and that's been implemented, nearly every state has taken some kind of administrative action to try to address exclusionary discipline in childcare settings. We know that here, probably more than anywhere, the policies vary greatly, and most of them are weaker on the quality side than what we would like to see in terms of protections for children. Many of them, no state prohibits the practice, even within parameters. And most of the policies focus around advising parents and telling parents when this is happening. So, letting them know and keeping an open line of communication and engaging families, family notifications. Some states have required some data collection requirements. Some states have opened up options for professional development. So nobody's required professional development in discipline and social emotional, in bias, or kind of the combination of how these things all come together. But some have made it an option. And then several states, or some states, as you can see in the report, permit it as a last resort. So we know that sometimes that is not meaningful in terms of the steps folks have to take to push a child out of school. Head Start, if we take a look at Head Start, Head Start prohibits expulsions and limits suspensions, and it has a whole lot of caveats around when you can suspend, and it's a limited amount of time, and there are a whole lot of supports and interventions and collaboration with parents and mental health consultants and others are kind of required to really try to prevent this and make it a very rare occurrence and address the issue when it does happen. This new explicit language on exclusionary discipline is new to the Head Start regulations with the 2016 redo of the Head Start program performance standards that were finalized in 2016. Before that, it was common practice and kind of common knowledge that Head Start does not expel or suspend. But with the redo of those regulations in 2016, it kind of was codified into the rule. Next slide, please. So if we look at pre-K through the early grades and kind of the public school system, we know that more than half of all states have addressed exclusionary discipline in some way and limited it or tried to limit it in some way. The extent of the limitation varies. So we see some places, provide protections for just kids in pre-K. Some go pre-K to second grade, pre-K to third. So that varies the extent of, what age children are covered. There's also a lot of variability around the exceptions. So nobody prohibits the practice outright. All of those who have made steps in that direction have a whole number of exceptions for when you can, or when you are allowed to suspend or expel a child. Again, a lot of this work has been done kind of in the silos of specific systems. So Head Start, as I mentioned, childcare, pre-K. There have been a number of states, here's a list of some of those, that have passed some reforms that address this issue across, all of the systems where young children learn. So childcare, Head Start, or not Head Start because that's federal, but childcare and their pre-K system. So here's a list of some of those. Next slide, please. So now let's switch to corporal punishment. And as you see, the definition here in the Civil Rights Data Collection for corporal punishment is paddling, spanking, or other uses of force or physical punishment imposed on a child in a school setting. Next slide, please. So we know that corporal punishment is legal in schools, public schools, in 19 states. We know that it's legal in private schools in every single state in the country except for 2, New Jersey and Iowa. We know that 45,000 public and private, that kind of covers 45,000 public and private pre-K settings. Next slide, please. So here's some data and some facts on corporal punishment and what we found. And this is all, I think this is all from the Civil Rights Data Collection at the Department of Education. We found that there was 160,000 kids pre-K to 12th grade who were subject to corporal punishment in a single school year. 1,500 of those were 3 and 4-year-olds. We know that Black children make up about 16% of enrollment, but 33% of corporal punishment cases. And that translates to 40,000 Black children being subject to corporal punishment in a single school year. We know that Black boys are 2 times more likely to be corporally punished than their peers, than other white boys, and Black girls are 3 times more likely to be corporally punished than white girls. We know, turning to disabilities, in the 4 states that really make up the highest proportion of corporal punishment cases across the country, children with disabilities make up more than 2 times the number of cases. And the last piece that I will highlight is that American Indian Alaskan children make up less than 1%, if we're looking at kind of the preschool population, but 9% of corporal punishment cases. So that disparity is really astounding. Next slide, please. So we ran a similar type of analysis as we did for discipline, but we looked at corporal punishment in all of the states where it is legal. And we looked at what the rates were for, again, young children pre-K through elementary school, that early years through the early grades time period. And we found that the rate of disparities, so the difference between the total percentage of enrollment of young children and the total percentage of corporal punishment cases that they made up, varied quite a bit from state to state. The states that we're pointing to with these arrows kind of make up drive some of the largest differences. So for example, if we look at South Carolina, Black children make up about 38% of the population, but half of all corporal punishment cases. We also find that American Indian Alaska Native children are disproportionately corporally punished, as I mentioned earlier. And in particular, if we look at North Carolina, where AIAN students make up just over 1% of the population, but they make up over 11% of corporal punishment cases. And in Oklahoma, they make up just over 11% of the population and almost a quarter of all corporal punishment cases. Next slide, please. So now let's pivot to restraint and seclusion. And I won't read the definitions, but really restraint is immobilizing or reducing the ability of a child to move by holding them. There's also a form of restraint that's called mechanical restraint, and that's the use of some kind of device or equipment. And then looking at seclusion, it's the involuntary confinement of a student alone in a room. So it's really basically putting a child in a room without the ability to get out. So locking the door or physically standing in the way of the door and holding the door closed so they can't get out. Next slide, please. So if we look at the data, we know that 86,000 children were physically restrained in a single school year. The Government Accountability Office released a report on abuses, and there are many, many stories as disturbing as this one in that GAO report and in several kind of investigative reporting that's been conducted ever since. Just recently, a young boy, 16-year-old boy, was killed after being restrained by several staff members and not being able to breathe for throwing a piece of food in the cafeteria was the catalyst. 19 states have no limits on restraint of children, and 12 states have no limits for restraint, even for children with disabilities. Next slide, please. So if we look at seclusion, again, this is kind of solitary confinement for young children. We see that 36,000 children were secluded in a single school year. We know that with many of these, there may be reporting issues that actually undercount the phenomenon. But here is another kind of excerpt from that same GAO report that found that a boy with a learning disability in elementary school was locked into a seclusion room 75 times over a 6-month period for multiple hours at a time. The reasons cited for the seclusion, all of those different times, included things like whistling, slouching, and hand waving. Just recently, the Chicago Tribune and ProPublica released an investigative report looking at the use of seclusion in schools in Illinois. And I'll quote from the article. It said, children were sent to isolation after refusing to do classwork, for swearing, for spilling milk, for throwing Legos. School employees used isolated timeout, which is what they call them, the quiet rooms, for convenience, out of frustration, or as punishment, sometimes referring to it as serving time, end quote. Next slide, please. So when we look at seclusion policies across the country, here's what we find. I think the main takeaway here is that blue key, right? The blue states are the states that ban seclusion outright. And what I just described, right, there's only 2 states in the entire country that ban seclusion outright. Some states ban seclusion for children with disabilities. Some states limit seclusion for children with disabilities. Some states explicitly limit seclusion for all children and really narrow it down for incidents involving a serious safety threat. Next slide, please. So here is part of our policy agenda, right? And we'd refer you to the full report because these recommendations are only a sampling of what is in the full policy agenda. But I'll go over some of the key findings here and recommendations. We wanted to ensure that all of our recommendations were actionable and specific and concrete. So we'll start with the congressional piece. The first thing that we recommend is really passing legislation, discipline reform legislation, that would end corporal punishment and seclusion and exclusionary discipline, and would limit restraint and put appropriate parameters around its use across all programs that serve young children and receive federal funding. We recommend making some changes when IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, comes up for reauthorization, addressing the issue of suspension and addressing the issue of seclusion and restraint within there as well. And in particular, eliminating that 10-day allowance that gives schools and districts the ability to kind of expel or suspend children with disabilities for 10 days at a time. And seclusion and restraint is largely silent in the law. Increased funding for mental health interventions and for mental health and social emotional personnel. And really looking at prioritizing children's mental health and positive school climate over punitive discipline in budgets, such as school resource officers. When we look at federal agencies, one of the first ones that we bring up is kind of using that bully pulpit and that national stage to raise awareness and continue raising awareness about the negative impacts of harsh discipline and the rights that families have to kind of fight the disproportionate and the disparate impact of these things. increasing tying federal funds to state progress on reducing harsh discipline and disparities in their use, reinstating guidance that discourages the use of exclusionary discipline and addresses and investigates racial disparities, and really requiring states to report the use of harsh discipline and its disproportionate application in childcare settings, which is a major data gap right now. When we look at states, some of these recommendations are nested. So we recommend similarly prohibiting corporal punishment, seclusion, exclusionary discipline in learning settings that serve young children, investing in data systems and professional development. And we tie those two things together because tracking the data and tracking disaggregated data and disparities kind of on real time in a rapid cycle, and being able to feed those data back into professional development and policy change at the local, state and local level, we think is really critical to addressing this issue. And the other piece is developing infrastructure to receive, investigate, and act on parent complaints. In too many places, there is no place and no system and no infrastructure for parents to send in grievances and to kind of make the case and appeal and things like that. And so we recommend developing some sort of an infrastructure, including potentially child protective service infrastructure, and expanding that to include abuses that happen at school. Finally, if we look at the district recommendations, again, they're nested, banning harsh discipline, even in states where it remains legal. So even if districts reside within a state where corporal punishment is legal, it doesn't mean they have to do it. They can implement their own policies to not do it. Ensuring that young children, again, this seems like quite low-hanging fruit, and unfortunately we have to say it anyway, but ensuring that young children never have negative interactions with school resource officers via intimidation, inappropriate restraint, handcuffing, or arrest. We have seen more than we should ever see of cases of kindergarteners and first graders being handcuffed and actually put in police cars, police vehicles, and taken to the station for behavior that is either developmentally appropriate or should certainly be handled by a social emotional specialist or a mental health specialist or special educator or other folks that can provide support as opposed to causing that trauma. And the last piece I'll mention is investing in systems for training, coaching, and evaluating the use of positive discipline and anti-bias approaches. You'll see that theme across many of our recommendations. Bias and anti-racism and the effects of bias in perceiving behavior and in making discipline decisions has to be core to all of our professional development, preparation and professional development ongoing on an ongoing basis. We can't think about behavior without thinking about bias, because bias colors the way in which we perceive behavior, and it affects the way that we make decisions and what we decide based on each individual child. So I will stop there and encourage folks to look at the full report for the full list of recommendations that we make. Next slide, please. So now it is just my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce and hand this over to Chair Catherine E. Lamon. Catherine Lamon is the chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, a position she was appointed to by President Obama in 2016. She also serves in the cabinet of California Governor Gavin Newsom, where she has been Legal Affairs Secretary since January of 2019. She previously served as the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights and oversaw all of the data collection that we talked about today at the U.S. Department of Education until January of 2017. Chair Lamon, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meek, and I will say what a deep pleasure it is to see the civil rights data collection still in good use. So thank you for your presentation. Thank you to the Children's Equity Project and the Bipartisan Policy Center for bringing us here today to discuss school discipline as a key area of reform to achieve racial equity in education. The way school discipline is imposed in schools around the country has been a long-standing concern for parents, educators, and civil rights advocates for decades. I am so grateful to see this important issue given attention in the report you issued this month, discussed alongside other critical issues in equitable education opportunities for all students. This report that we discussed today is bracing in what it tells us about the state of school discipline for children across the country. And it confirms what I have seen throughout my civil rights work, including from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights 2019 report on civil rights issues related to discipline of students of color with disabilities. The very first desegregation agreements, the Federal Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, was initially created to secure and enforce in the middle 1960s, included disparities in school discipline as core components of their desegregation work. All those years ago, racially disparate school discipline was a feature, not an aberration, of segregated schooling. And so I am especially glad to see the strong recommendations in this report consistent with Commission recommendations, specifically on school discipline as well as generally on federal civil rights enforcement, calling for federal agencies to reinstate federal discipline guidance that discourages the use of exclusionary discipline and promotes positive school climates and mental health supports. The Office for Civil Rights' appropriate role, the one Congress has assigned to it now for 6 decades, is to investigate facts and where it determines that the law has been violated, to work with schools to ensure that they operate non-discriminatory practices going forward. OCR's mandate is to open for investigation any complaint over which it has jurisdiction. That mandate now means, and historically has meant, that OCR investigates hundreds of complaints alleging discrimination in school discipline practices on the basis of race and disability, and specifically about the use of restraint and seclusion in schools. I'm so glad to see the recommendations to direct more funding towards support for students like counselors, social workers, training for educators, consistent with one of the Commission's primary recommendations as well. And I want to emphasize to you all what I know from the Commission's investigations, and also as the former chief civil rights enforcer in the nation's schools in the Obama administration, and finally as a mom of 2 girls in public schools. When discrimination is visible and unchecked in our schools, we send a message to all our kids that it is permissible. When students see that students of color are more likely to receive exclusionary discipline for behaviors white students engage in but do not receive like discipline for, students learn and our schools reinforce discrimination that has for 6 decades been legally anathema in our nation. We owe it to them, and we owe it to ourselves to correct that pattern and instruct our students consistent with our lawful values. With that, we'll now turn to our panel, which is quite distinguished, and which includes Dr. Rosemarie Allen, Assistant Professor in the School of Education at Metropolitan State University of Denver, and founder and CEO of the Institute for Racial Equity and Excellence, and Dr. Kent McIntosh, Professor in the Department of Special Education and Clinical Sciences at the University of Oregon and Director of Education and Community Supports, Dr. Walter Gilliam, Professor of Child Psychiatry and Psychology at the Yale University Child Study Center and the Director of the Edward Ziegler Center in Child Development and Social Policy, and Dr. Tunette Powers, Director, UCLA Parent Curriculum Project. For those joining us online, please submit your questions for the panelists using the live chat function on YouTube, Facebook, or on Twitter with the hashtag BPCLive or Start with Equity. I'll begin with a question for all of our panelists, and I'm going to begin with Dr. Allen, and I'll just let those who are joining us online know that we'll monitor the questions, and then when it's time to open for those questions, I'll be able to go through the questions that have come in and share them. So beginning with Dr. Allen, can you contextualize the findings and policy agenda in the Start with Equity report with the current uprising against social justice in this country that we're in the midst of? In your view, is this time different? And if so, what do we have to do to maintain the issue of harsh discipline on the agenda for reform? And after Dr. Allen goes, we'll go to all of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In my view, I do believe that this time is different. As we see people taking to the street, demanding justice after the murder of George Floyd, we're seeing some things that we've not yet seen, that we've not seen before. The protest in and of itself is not new, but I believe the multiracial, multi-generational approach is very, very new. And I believe what happened is that there was this perfect storm of COVID-19 and what we witnessed on television with George Floyd. COVID-19 had us in our homes, unable to turn away from the death, from the murder that we witnessed. We actually saw George Floyd take his last breath right before he called out to his mom, who had died 18 months earlier. What we have to understand is what happened to George Floyd isn't unusual in this country. Chantel, Dr. Meek talked about what happens in early childhood environments, and the soil was fertilized for what happened to George Floyd early in our early childhood programs. In our early childhood programs, we have future doctors, future lawyers, future police officers, and they're learning in our early childhood programs right now who's dispensable, who's not, who's valued, who is not. And when we look at what is also happening in our programs is based on research. We know that as early as 3, 4, and 5 years old, young children, especially Black and brown boys, are subjected to adultification. So they are already assumed to be at up to 4.5 years older than they are. So in early childhood, they lose this precious gift of innocence. So they're thought to be more culpable, more criminal. So if they're already seen as more criminal at 4, imagine what happens at 14, at 24, at 34. And where they're also thought to be more of a threat and more aggressive if they're bigger. Right here in Colorado, you look at the case of Elijah McClain, who was thought to be over 220 pounds, and he's 140, and lost his life at the hands of police officers. So yes, this time it's different, but it's not new. If we can address these issues early, then today's preschoolers won't be tomorrow's protesters, because we will have taken care of this issue.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. We can turn next to Dr. McIntosh. Dr. McIntosh, I think you're on mute. So we see you talking, but we can't hear you. We still can't hear you. We're still not able to hear you. Maybe I'll pause on that and we'll turn to Professor Gilliam and we'll come back, see if we can get your sound working. Professor Gilliam?
Well, I mean, it's a great question in terms of what's different now. I don't really remember much of the 60s. I was only 2 when the 60s finished, but I do know a lot of folks who do remember the 60s. And what they tell me feels different to them is the diversity of those who are protesting and the diversity of the voices that they're hearing from. And there's hope in that. I find myself hopeful. I find myself hopeful that things will be different now because it's us. And maybe that's a bit egotistical for me to be thinking that way about us in general. But you know, every moment has an us, and how that moment turns out and what comes out of that moment is going to depend on the people who are in that moment and whether they recognize the fact that they are in a moment. We are in a moment right now, but it's a moment about an issue and a problem that we've had on our soil here for over 400 years. I'm glad that you mentioned earlier, Chair Aman, the history of the civil rights, but the history, of course, of African American experience in the United States goes back 4 centuries. And of those 4 centuries, of those 400 years, 350 of them almost were spent in either slavery or segregation. 250 of those years spent when it was illegal in most places for Black children to go to school, illegal for them to have a book, illegal for them to become literate. And then another 100 years of it spent where it was in segregated schooling, where there was far less opportunity provided for them. And only recently any effort to change any of that. And then to find ourselves with that kind of a history, now expelling children at twice the rate from preschool programs if they're African American. I find it just completely intolerable. I mean, just the notion that we could spend 350 years systematically denying opportunity to African American children. Then when we create preschool programs to give them opportunity, 2 times over, expel them out the back door. Just absolutely, just I'm speechless in terms of what that means, and the fact that we absolutely have to solve this. When we're talking about expulsion, we're talking about a civil rights issue here. We're talking about access to opportunity. Preschool programs are about opportunity. And when we talk about denying children an opportunity to be able to participate in these programs, that's a denial of access. And that is most definitely a civil rights issue. You want me to keep going? I can keep going.
No, thank you. I wanted to turn to Dr. Powell next to answer this question if we could.
Yes. So first of all, to take time to uplift the families who are watching, who have experienced this, who continue to live and experience this, because this is, it's their real lives. It's what they deal with. It is the trauma that every day in and day out. So I want to lift them up. And I'm not as hopeful as Dr. Allen, but I want to be. And I say that because as I watch what's happening all around the country, and we think about Taylor and Tony McDade, and we think about George Floyd, and we are horrified, and we're in a moment where we want to do something. I'm just hoping that we will not only focus and silo our thing, that we will be able to see how that violence that we saw in the video of George Floyd is also happening in schools in a different way. That we're able to see that there are so many systems of violence, and we have to dismantle all of them. And so sometimes, the mother in me, the scholar in me who has done this, and the educator in me loses hope at times because we tend to look outside of education. These things are bad. Schools are these great equalizers, but we know that from the report and from tons of reports that we've had over and over again, that schools are also spaces and sites of trauma, and there is a violence there to ignore.
Maybe we can see if Dr. McIntosh will be able to hear you this time. So let's turn
We'll
to Dr.
see.
McIntosh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
How
it
about
worked.
this? Okay. I can't imagine saying anything better than what Drs. Allen, Gilliam, and Powell said. I do see this as a fleeting opportunity. So I think that while there's this momentum, we need to take it and move with it.
So let's use that for this conversation, and I hope that each of you, and why don't I start with Dr. Powell for this question, but I hope that each of you could personalize what we've been talking about. We had a lot of data that we heard in the initial presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Meek, for that. That data is so critical for us to have our eyes open to what this problem is that we need to solve. But let's also talk about a child, an educator, a school situation that you all see in the work that you do, so that we can bring this conversation to the specifics of who the kids are and what the educational experiences are that we're trying to work on. So Dr. Powell, could you start us off?
Sure, absolutely. And I know I'll tell for the sake of time. There was, in my most recent work, I interviewed a cross-country sample of parents, of Black parents who all had a young child suspended. For some parents, their children were suspended, ago. For some, it was over the last couple of school years. And there was one parent who is in the Texas area, and her son was suspended when he was 2 years old. And, people say, well, oh my gosh, 2 years old, been off the chain. But it was not that at all. He took his clothes off and they sent him home. And I think this notion that Dr. Allen was talking about the innocence that is robbed of young Black boys and girls, most impressionable and earlier stages of their lives, that the appropriateness of a 2-year-old taking their clothes off could be perceived as something that you needed to be sent home for, is something that is startling and is heartbreaking, common. And, another story that, I'll share, and this story is, I share this because it was so long ago. There was a mother in my study whose son was suspended about 25. And I share this story because when I interviewed her over the 2018 year, she's sharing this story as if it was yesterday. And she is talking about what she cares. Her son is a grown person who has gone on with his life, is no longer in the home. But she kept talking about the poetry that she was writing. And in her poetry, there was this loss of self. There was this loss of communality that has, there was these feelings of powerlessness even to this day. And so when we talk about what this means, thinking about the souls behind the statistics is incredibly important for us, because we have a 2-year-old that was taking off his clothes. We have parents that have to live with these type of situations, and they have no power to be able to appeal these processes, even though they try. They have, they have to deal with the internal battle of losing, shifting in identity, where they went from thinking they were doing a good job to believing that they are bad parents. They're damaging, right? There's damage done to those most intimate bonds and relationships that they have with their children and other family members. While they are pushing through, and we celebrate that resilience, but we shouldn't have to keep surviving these systems that are meant to build us, nurture, care for our kids. And so I share those stories because I want us to think about individual trauma, but the collective trauma in the experience of young children being suspended and pushed out of school.
Thanks so much. Maybe we can turn to Dr. Gilliam next for this question.
Sure. I mean, there's so many stories that you can tell, So I'll tell you about one story. So there was this child who was 3 years old, and he came to a preschool program. I know about this because I was involved in the story, trying to work with the child care program because they were concerned about this child. And what this 3-year-old child did was he, as soon as he enrolled in the child care program, he would have this tendency at nap time to crawl up in his teacher's lap and curl up into a ball. And some of the times he would lay there in the teacher's lap and just fall asleep during nap time, or during the time when the teacher was reading a book to all the other children. But some days the child would crawl up in the teacher's lap, and instead of falling asleep, he'd look up at her and look her in the eyes and punch her in the face. And the teacher never really knew which was going to happen on any given day. And the teacher was wanting to keep the child in the program, but wasn't sure how to do this, and she wasn't sure what to do. And so I got involved, and we met with the family. I met with the family, and I tried to find out some of the story. And the story was that for this child was brought to the child's biological father and introduced to him at about 3 years old, and told that this is your child, and can you watch him? I have an emergency, and I'll be right back. But for whatever reason, mom never came back, and so the child ended up staying with his biological father and his biological father's wife, and they both had jobs and they needed child care, and so they enrolled him in a child care program. And it's one of those stories where if you don't understand the backstory of the stress that was happening in the life of this child, it might not make sense what this child was doing. But when you understand some of the backstory, you might realize that this is a child who at 3 years old, we're talking about a baby here. I mean, this child is barely out of diapers. We're talking about a child who misses his mother, and at the same time is very angry about his mother. And the closest thing to mother at that time in that program was this child care provider who was taking care of him. And some of the times he wanted to curl up in her lap, and some of the times he wanted to haul off and hit her. And I'm not saying that knowing the backstory fixes the problem, but certainly knowing something about the stress that children are going through, or that families are going through, or even that childcare providers are going through, can sometimes give us the tools that we need in order to be able to come up with solutions. And if not give us the tools that we need to come up with solutions, hopefully at least give us what we need to have a little empathy and to realize that this is not an easy thing for providers. It's probably not an easy thing for that child either. And it's not an easy thing for that family. And so in a way, what I think I've told you is not a story about a child who was expelled. I told you a story about a child who probably would have been under a lot of other normal circumstances. But in this case, because we knew more about the story, because we cared to find out, this child wasn't.
Thank you. Maybe we could turn to Dr. McIntosh.
Sure. I'll tell a slightly different story of a Black school principal who I know who has regularly seen the school to prison pipeline coming through his way in terms of the students who are sent to his office for discipline. And I think one of the things that's most hurtful or painful is being on the receiving end of these students who are being excluded from instruction, being asked for what to do, and also working in a school district where he is one of very few administrators of color, and is being expected to follow through with a disciplinary code that he doesn't necessarily agree with. And, when it comes down to the question of who is he trying to protect and who does he need to comfort and discomfort? There's the challenge of not being able to speak openly and directly about equity in school discipline, about equity in classroom practices, and being the person who is carrying out unfair and unequitable school discipline practices.
Dr. Allen, could you bring us home on this question?
Absolutely. I'm thinking, of course, as Dr. Gilliam said, there are so many stories, but one that's just really coming to mind for me today is the story of an African-American boy named Riley, 4 years old, who was first suspended for kissing and hugging a girl. And it wasn't enough that he was suspended, but it was the labeling of the behavior, that he was sexually harassing this young lady. And then the label stuck with him, so that every time he was near a girl, touched a girl, played with a girl, the mother was called over and over and over again. And what was so painful was to see this family begin to even question their own child. Do you think we need to put him in counseling? Is his behavior abnormal? Should I be concerned that he is interacting with these girls? And it was amazing because in our organization, parents call us when they have these issues. And I went to observe the child in the classroom, and he played with boys and girls almost equally. But anytime he became very close to a girl, whether in play or whatever, the teachers, it was like they were hyper-focused whenever he was near a little girl. And they had basically, again, using that adultification, robbing him of his innocence, hypersexualizing his behavior. They labeled him, and he couldn't escape it. And we see these behaviors over and over. He ended up being suspended twice for the sexual harassment, is what they called it. But of course, he was too young to be referred to the police. But it was really, really unfortunate the way that this child was hypersexualized and adultified, just being a boy playing with both boys and girls in his child care facility.
Thank you. Our next question I'll also ask all of the panelists, and this time, just as fair warning, I'll start with Dr. Gilliam. The policy recommendations in the report that we're discussing today are very detailed and extensive, which I delight in. And I wonder if each of you could identify one or possibly two of the recommendations that you think is highest priority for you, or the key priority for you for how we move forward in an equity agenda on this topic. So Dr. Gilliam, will you start us?
Yeah, great question. If I can, I'd like to try to address it by building on what my good friend Dr. Allen just said. Her story reminded me of another story from about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was doing more of this kind of work directly in childcare programs. I got a call from a childcare program because they were worried about this African-American boy that they were saying, the teachers were saying, like to play with the dolls naked and like to make them do things. And I said, well, what do you mean do things? And they said, well, just do things with the naked dolls. And I said, well, I still don't understand. They said, well, why don't you come out here and take a look, and I think you'll understand. And so I went out there and I took a look and I watched the child for about an hour, 2 hours, or maybe more, playing with dolls and playing with other types of things and just doing all sorts of things in a classroom that a lot of other children would do. And he did indeed like to play with the dolls, and he would make them walk together and do things like go to the store, go play here, or talk to each other. And of course, the teachers were right that the child, was playing with the dolls and they were naked. And then just on a whim, I just that moment, when in fact the reality of that play was probably very, very different. And that brings me to the answer to your question, or at least my answer to your question, in terms of what I think are the two best recommendations. And they're both about harsh discipline. And one of them is to, one, stop doing that. Just stop doing it. Stop kicking kids out of preschool programs. But two, to do something else. Invest in early childhood mental health consultation systems where people can come into a child care program and work directly with the teachers and be able to see what's going on and give them feedback and help them be able to maybe see circumstances in a different way, or to be able to form a better, stronger relationship with parents, or to invest in positive behavioral interventions like Dr. Kent McIntosh can talk to us about. Anything. The idea behind this is that preschool expulsion and suspension, and even corporal punishment, these are not solutions. These are non-solutions. This is what we do when we don't know what else to do. And the tragedy about that is that we do know what else to do. We just don't invest in it. And instead, we kick these children out of these programs in order to appear in some other program later on down the road. Preschool child care programs are not Las Vegas. What happens in preschool does not stay in preschool. When we treat children in this way where they're disposable, when they're 2, 3, 4 years old, that sticks with them. And that's going to be the way in which they see themselves and their relationship to school, probably for the rest of their educational career.
Thank you. Dr. Allen, can we hear from you?
Yes, and I appreciate so much what Dr. Gilliam said. And I think the first rule and what I love about the recommendations is do no harm. We are doing harm. The interventions, the harsh discipline, exclusionary discipline, seclusion and restraint, they just don't work. So again, like he said, stop doing it. What I absolutely love about this report is the supports, the recommended supports for staff and for children, the focus on mental health. I also love that it's multi-leveled. So we go from Congress to federal institutions to state level recommendations to local and school district recommendations, and they're all aligned. So we can start high, end low, start low, end high, do what you can, where you can, so that we can stop this insidious practice of doing harm, especially to our youngest children.
Thank you. Dr. McIntosh, how about you?
Agree with those entirely. I think one of the things that we want to watch out for is spending so much time on what not to do that we don't actually equip our educators with the skills to actually build positive relationships with students, be clear about what we want from them, teach them the skills that they need to be successful. And I think about some of the direct work that I was doing earlier on. It is a much easier, better, and more effective way to do it. Instead of just saying, here's what not to do, give them the tools that they need and invest in the system of coaching so that they are able to put those into practice and have people come in and be able to consult with them on what it looks like, fit it to their classroom, fit it to their situations, and be supported in the work instead of blamed for a lack of possible options for discipline.
Thank you. Dr. Powell?
Thank you. I think I agree with all of what everybody has said here. I think I would that number one, yes, we need to stop doing it. I think that, that has been, suspension and expulsion have been lazy responses to behavior. I also think that this point about and different training for educators is extremely important. It always amazes me, especially in the early childhood education setting, how many educators have never heard the term implicit bias. And so we have a lot of work to do, because some of the work that's being done around how do we support behavior of young people and how do we respond more at a developmentally appropriate age, it's important work, but it doesn't allow us to think about the when children are doing things that are fine, they don't need a response, but educators still see them as older than they are, as more, guilty and less innocent. And some of these things that continue to plague our system have to be able to deal with what happens when a child did nothing wrong and it was simply on the part of adults because of some of the implicit and at times explicit bias. We have to have something in place to be able to deal with that.
I'm going to come back to you with a question, but I want to just say we're coming close to the time when I'm going to open up for questions from our audience. And so I just want to remind folks, I'm seeing questions come in. I'm very grateful for it. But for others, you can use the live chat function on YouTube and Facebook, and on Twitter, if you use the hashtag BPCLive or Start with Equity, we'll see the questions and then I can tee them up for us. But Dr. Powell, coming back to you, you wrote an op-ed a few years ago that I saw at the time and I've carried with me since. It was incredibly meaningful. You talked about your experience as a parent of a child who had experienced this kind of discipline. And I wonder if you could share a bit about that with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. 2014 is never far away from my mind. My two oldest sons, they were 3 and 4 years old in 2014, and they were both suspended from school. And it was something that rocked my world. I want to get a PhD and study this. It was, I probably, I experienced so many different emotions. And for me, and I also see this with parents, because my children were so young, I wanted to carry a lot and I wanted to protect the innocence that they still did have left. So, when my oldest son was suspended, and I remember he was at the breakfast table at his early child care center and he was crying. It said, if you're crying, you have to leave the breakfast table because you could spread germs. So they made him leave and he pushed a chair. And because of that reaction, right, being told to leave and then pushing a chair, he was suspended. I'll never forget when I wrote that piece in 2014, all of the comments from people around the country saying, your son, he's going to end up in a prison. You're probably just a single mother on welfare. Your baby's dad prison, something's wrong with your son mentally. And again, this is what we do, right? We say, that if a young child is being suspended, then it must be something wrong with that child. It must be something wrong with that. When you put Black in there, that mother must be single. She must be on welfare, because to parents in 2-parent homes that are middle class or, beyond middle class, this doesn't happen. That is what we begin to tell about what's happening and who it's happening to. And so it's very difficult for me because I internalized my experience as I must be a bad parent. And especially as someone who was also suspended and expelled in early childhood education, expelled from preschool. And so it was a very difficult time for me. And if it had not been for the data that was also released in 2014 from the Office of Civil Rights, I might have stayed in that place. And that's why this report is important. Because as soon as that data was released, which is around the same time, people were sending it to me. And it was this moment where I said, I'm not the only one. My kids are not.
I'm very, very grateful that you have taken that baton and shared it with so many other people. And I'm glad that the data reporting was helpful to you and is helpful in the country as well. On that same hopeful note, I want to ask Dr. McIntosh, you run the National Center on PBIS and have, I hope, ideas about some of the good working progress that PBIS, which is the model that most often gets lifted up as an alternative to exclusionary school discipline. I hope that you could share with us some of the kinds of principles that you know to work and are available to schools.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we know from multiple studies that if you implement PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports with fidelity, you can actually decrease. We've seen 2 studies showing decreases in disciplinary inequities or disproportionality in exclusions. However, they don't get rid of them entirely. And so we have an equity work group that has been working for the past 6 years on developing free resources for educators and administrators and district and state administrators for putting effective but also feasible strategies in place to do that. And now we've got multiple examples across the country of schools implementing the approaches that we look at. So we talk about looking at using discipline data, not just to identify the extent of disparities, but also to identify specific situations where educators and administrators are more likely to be disproportionate than others. And that changes things up a whole lot when we are able to say, under these circumstances, this time of day, these specific behaviors, these settings in the school, you're able to make equitable decisions. And under this set of circumstances, you're making inequitable decisions where your implicit or explicit biases are influencing the decisions that you make. So that in combination with implementing cultural responsive elements of classroom management, including giving students and families voice in what their education systems look like, and then also training responses for neutralizing implicit bias or biased harsh responses in the classroom. So you can find all of those for free on our equity page on pbis.org.
Thanks so much. I'm going to turn to questions that have been coming in and just remind folks who are participating again that you can use the chat function on YouTube and on Facebook to submit your questions, and also on Twitter. We will look for them. But here are a couple of questions that have come in. First, Leanne Corville was asking, she wonders if we also have data on Native American students in the early childhood years or where we might find that. And I will just take a pause to say that I know that the Civil Rights Data Collection does include that data. And if you go and Google CRDC data, you will be able to find that. And I'll invite the other panelists, if you have specific topics or thoughts about Native American students and their experience in this area, I'd love to have you speak to that. I'm going to also just turn to one of the questions so that we use our time efficiently. And this question comes from Alan Gutman. And he's asking, could you please speak to the intersection of corporal punishment and educator-caregiver requirements under mandated child abuse reporting laws? So I will invite our panelists to speak to both topics, if you can. And maybe, Dr. Allen, we could start with you. Dr. Allen, you're on mute. There we go.
Okay, so
Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you.
I often say that educators can abuse children, actually hit children with weapons in our schools with impunity. If parents did exactly the same thing, then teachers would be required to report them to social services. And schools are the last institutions in America where you can actually abuse children. You can't do it in youth corrections. You can't do it in our penal system. There's no place else, no other institution where you can hit children literally with a wooden weapon, leave marks and cause harm, and not be subjected to any consequences for it.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Gilliam?
Well, I want to go back to the question, if I can, about Native Americans, and to be able to say that when we first came out with our report on preschool expulsion and children being expelled from preschool programs, and that was a report that was released back in 2005, one of the very first groups to respond to it with any degree of policy regarding how they're going to approach this and what they thought about it and the need to reduce the likelihood of expulsion in preschool programs was the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation. They jumped on top of it really quickly and saw that indeed that's something that happens within the Native American population, at least for Eastern Band Cherokee, and were highly involved in it. We oftentimes forget our Native American children and families in these kind of analyses, but They have specific vulnerabilities and needs that we absolutely need to be taken into consideration. And I'm glad that the Office of Civil Rights under your watch, Chair, was making sure that we were keeping track of information on them.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Dr. Powell.
I don't want to add anything to that, just to add for adding sake. I agree with both of those things. I think that when it comes to, Native American students in early child education, we know that there are also huge disparities when we think about school suspension and expulsion. So everything that Dr. And yeah, I don't want to add anything else.
So I will jump in on that just because of the benefit of the work I've seen on this, both in my time at the commission and also before then when I was at the Office for Civil Rights. In the Trump administration, the Office for Civil Rights closed an investigation of discrimination against Native American students in a California school and concluded that the students were subject to exclusionary school discipline at rates that did not coincide with their white peers in the school. There were a pretty small number of the students in the school and a very large proportion of the students who were subject to exclusionary school discipline. They also were not offered supports for behaviors that were disability-based, even though the teachers were over and over and over asking for those kinds of supports and evaluations for the students in school. So those kinds of harms for those students violate our core federal civil rights laws, and I've been grateful to see that the Office for Civil Rights in the current administration continues to enforce in important ways on that topic. So the question about how this experience occurs for Native American students is current, present, and deeply harmful in the kinds of ways that we are seeing for other students as well. So I just wanted to make sure to lift that up. But Dr. McIntosh, did you want to speak to the first question as well, or the second?
Oh, I would only add the smallest little bit in that in those states that allow corporal punishment, we have information in the policy guide to say there's no reason why you can't, as a district, restrict or end corporal punishment. And I think we're beyond the time when we think that hitting children is an acceptable response.
Very much agree with that. Thank you. Dr. Gilliam, you published the first study about 15 years ago about early childhood discipline and disparities and harms that can follow from it. I wonder if you could just share with us what prompted that work then and what has changed in the intervening decade and a half, or what has not changed, where you think we are with respect to that work.
Wow, was it really 15 years ago? I mean, getting older before my own eyes. It seems like a long time ago. In a way, it seems like it wasn't a very long time ago. It was it really wasn't even a study of expulsion. It was supposed to be a study of how preschool programs were being implemented across the nation. And it so happened that while we were getting ready to do this nationwide study of how preschool programs were being implemented across the nation, I was supervising child psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers learning how to work with young children. And I couldn't help but notice when I was on the other side of those two-way mirrors watching people try to learn how to work with young children that many of the children coming into our clinic at Yale for evaluations were sent to us at 3 and 4 years old because they'd been kicked out of a preschool program, or they were told that if they don't go to a place like Yale and get an evaluation that they will be kicked out of the preschool program. And so I had no idea how common this was. Very much like what Dr. Powell was saying before. If you don't know, then you certainly don't know, because this is not an issue that anyone's bragging about. Parents don't brag about it. Nobody has a bumper sticker that says "proud parent of an expelled preschooler," and no teachers going around talking about how glad that they were that they kicked a child out of school. They don't want to do it either. They do it because they don't know what else to do. And so this is one of those silent issues. But I was seeing it because we were seeing the fallout. And so we just literally threw some additional questions into this big national study. And in the end, that's what drove the entire study, because we found something that we really didn't expect to find, which was that in preschool programs, largely programs in public schools, like 2/3 of these were in the public schools, we're expelling children at a rate more than 3 times that of grades K through 12 combined. And that's just incredible to wrap your head. 3 and 4 year olds. We're talking about children who've been talking in sentences for a couple of years, or barely out of diapers, and they're already being kicked out of school before they even get to school. It's just mind-boggling. And when we found that, it changed my career, because then, before then I was mostly concerned about the quality of preschool programs and how do we get children into preschool programs, not being aware of the fact that there are forces within preschool programs that kick them back out the back door. And they kick them back out the back door with prejudice. That 4 times the rate for boys, 2.5 times or so the rate for African American children. And if you're a boy and African American, then you're at a much greater risk of being expelled. And so, in terms of what's become different, there's certainly a lot more awareness around this, and an awful lot of that I can attribute to my good friends Dr. Allen and Dr. Powell. Because they write about it and they present about it and they tell the stories about this and they humanize this. I mean, like, one of the things that I love about Dr. Powell and the work that she does talking about the parents' perspective of this is it humanizes the fact that we're talking about young children and families and the relationships. And I'll tell you really quickly one story that I almost never hear. I never hear the story of a child who was expelled from a preschool program when the teacher and the parents knew and liked each other. I just hardly ever hear that. And finding some kind of a way through their work to be able to form better relationships between parents and providers, I think that's the key.
Thank you. So we are closing on time. I want to give Professor Meek a chance to close us out. So I'm going to do a lightning round. If each of you could just do one finding that you want to make sure that our participants take home from this report, what would that finding be? Dr. Powell, will you start us?
This is, I think, for me, I think it was this statistic that there is nowhere in the country where it is mandated, that you have some form of anti-bias like that. So there are suggestions, things like that, but there is nowhere in the country where that is mandated. And so that's something that I want people to stay focused on and think about as we think about next steps.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Allen?
What has touched me so much during this webinar is the fact that both Dr. Powell and I were both suspended from early childhood programs. And now we're looking at our children being suspended. So the takeaway is to ban exclusionary discipline, seclusion, corporal punishment across the board, and provide our early childhood workforce with the supports that's needed so that they can actually enhance the development of young children.
Thank you. Dr. McIntosh?
The problem is widespread. It's across the entire country. And I think the most important thing when you look into the report is that there are solutions. You can no longer sit back and say, we don't have anything that's been shown, through rigorous research to increase racial equity in school discipline. We have it. So we just need to take the steps to fund it, support it, and put the systems in place to support our educators.
Thank you. Dr. Gilliam?
I think for me, the big finding is the overarching finding, which is that even still today, when education doesn't work right, for whatever reason, and doesn't serve the needs of children and families, our default understanding of that is that it must be something wrong with the child, and that the two solutions for that is to either get rid of the child or to hit the child. And we have to do better than that. That is not what education is about.
Thank you to all of these extraordinary panelists, and I will turn it back to Dr. Meek to close. Thank you very much for today.
Thank you, Chair Lehman, and thank you to our distinguished panel. I think it's abundantly clear from what we found in our report and from what we heard on this panel that we can't wait any longer. We're doing harm, and the harm is disproportionate, like so many other issues in our society, is unfairly put on the shoulders of our Black community. The solution requires federal, state, and local policy, as we review in the report. But if I could say what I think is the most important policy recommendation in there is really federal legislation to end this harm. Corporal punishment leaves physical marks on kids, and it doesn't differ based on what state they live in. Seclusion is just as harmful in Texas as it is in Mississippi. A child suspended in California misses days of school and learning just like a child suspended in Ohio. Something as harmful as what we're seeing here today has to start with federal legislation that provides protection to all kids regardless of where they live. I want to encourage folks to check out our full report and the full policy agenda in the report. You can find it at the links listed here. And I'd also like to remind folks to join us for our final 2 webinars in this series. The dates and topics are listed there. You can sign up on the Children's Equity Project or BPC's website listed there. And with that, I'll leave it at that. Thanks for joining us and have a great evening, everyone.